All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Visions for the Future of Higher Ed. Today, I am joined by our first guest as part of our mini series on American University, Angela Virtue. Thanks so much for being here today, Angela. Looking forward to having this conversation with you.
For having me.
Now, I'm going to give a quick introduction here, and I know I'll have to keep it brief for the time today, but you have a ton of really interesting experience to share. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation today. Folks, Angela is a professorial lecturer at American University in the Kogod School of Business, teaching AI, data analytics, and machine learning. But prior to that role, Angela actually had a major role as an AI and ML engineer for multiple pre-IPO SaaS companies, which is really interesting coming from the line of work I'm in. So I have a ton of questions for you on that front. I'm not sure we'll get to them in this episode, but I have a feeling we're going to be asking you to come back for a second one, Angela. But in that line of work, Angela was responsible for driving millions of dollars in revenue, improving customer retention, and flagging over $1.5 billion in potential fraud. So, with that experience, today she's focusing on the practical and ethical implementation of AI into real world business operations and primarily doing that in a higher education setting. So, with that incredible background, Angela, I'm curious, how did you decide to pursue a career in higher ed, and what is the story behind how you ended up in the role you're in today?
Yeah, so thanks for the great background on me. You definitely did your research. To your point, I had a whole career in the DC area where I was just going like startup to startup and kind of propping up a lot of their AI and machine learning functionalities and operations. And then around the time COVID hit, I actually started adjuncting for American University, like on the side. One of my old professors was kind of just like, hey, any chance you'd want to adjunct for us? Because I've been plugged into the community for a few years doing some TA or just like kind of staying connected to the classroom in our predictive analytics class. And I'm like, well, I'm stuck in my apartment. I might as well like do a little something else. And so that kind of got me the jump start into AU again, started adjuncting, and I just kind of fell in love with the mentorship and helping students, particularly in a business school, learn some of these like more technical side of the house and have them kind of go from being like, I don't know if I really want to do this to absolutely like loving it or realizing it's not exactly as it seems or it's not as hard as it seems. So that kind of gave me the jump in, and then I just kind of kept saying yes from there. My role kept growing and growing and growing, and about 2 years ago, I finally made the jump to come full time to academia.
Okay, you know what's funny is I'm starting to notice a trend for busy, ambitious people that it's the busiest people who will end up saying, "Yeah, I've got time for that extra little thing," and then it ends up taking them down an entirely different path. So it's always impressive, but I'm not entirely surprised, kind of having read a bit about your background, Angela, that you took on that extra work and role, and that it's led to something new and interesting for you, but also for the students. I always find it's lucky when students get to learn from someone who has the kind of industry experience you do, and has seen this in action in an entirely different setting than they might be used to. So, I'm hope your students recognize that, and if they're watching this, I'm sure they do. So, the first question I like to ask is really about what is giving you hope in higher education right now. It's a tricky time for this field, but there are so many interesting initiatives and projects that I've heard people working on. And a big thank you to Maddie Sheriff from the Belfort Group, who helped organize this, who actually told me a lot about the work that American University is doing on implementing AI and how fast you've moved to try and bring some new solutions into the school. So, with that sort of broad question in mind, what's giving you hope? Do you want to touch on a little bit of the work that you've done with the team at American University, or share any other stories that would be worth letting people know about, that there are exciting and interesting things happening in this space right now?
Of course. I think to answer that first question in like a broader sense, I think the thing that's most exciting to me, especially from like my startup background, is that we're at this point where everything's going to change. And I think higher education is really finally starting to get to that point of acceptance of saying, hey, the way that we've been doing this for however many years is starting to fall apart. And we really need to reevaluate what we expect our students to learn. And I want to say that Kogod's kind of been more at the forefront of this because we've been starting this work for a year and a half now. So we have a little bit of a lead there, and I can talk about what exactly that looks like in a minute. But now we're having all the other schools big public institutions, small private liberal arts schools, like any type of school, they're kind of coming to us now and saying, "Hey, how have you done this? What are you thinking about this?" And I think that next step is really reflecting on some learning outcomes, right? How does our traditional assessment of students change in this age of AI, and what learning outcomes do we now need to reflect those AI literacy skills that we're building on, right? And so we're at that inflection point, and I think there's a lot of good momentum there to get those answers finally. A little bit more about what we've been doing at Kogod for the past year and a half. We've been really, really heads down, dedicated, and kind of revamping our entire curriculum. This past fall, we had our first AI-infused curriculum where we had 20 classes split between what we'd call AI Artisan and AI Sage. That way, every single student, regardless of their major or their minor, would leave our school having some AI literacy skills. Our AI artisan classes are those that are a little bit less technical, more like ethical reasoning, ethical thinking. How do we think about the use of AI in business entertainment, right? In music or in law or things of those natures. More case studies, right? And then our AI Sage courses are those that are a little bit more technical, where you can be using it for finance. You can be using it to build like those machine learning models and actually kind of like get your hands in on some of the more technical side, more applicable side of the house as well. Since then, right, we just wrapped up our academic year. We've actually increased that number from 20 classes to 58, and each one of those courses have an AI learning outcome kind of attached to them as we think about more programmatically what we want that to look like. So we've kind of just hit the ground running. Definitely a little trial and error, seeing what works, what doesn't work. And then the other thing that's been super helpful is we'll have this monthly AI Friday call with all of our faculty and staff, where we can kind of just have a small space to kind of sit down together in a more casual setting and just talk about what's working, right? Because I think in this age of AI and trying to embed all this generative AI technology or tools into the classroom with the students, it's like sometimes our activities will hit and sometimes they won't. And knowing both sides of that has been super helpful in just getting us to go a little further.
That is super insightful, Angela. Thanks for giving such a comprehensive overview for that question because it's a big question. So I really appreciate it. And I can see why other institutions would come to Kogod and to American University for advice on how to approach this because it can feel overwhelming. And that's the sentiment I get from many of the leaders I've spoken to. But I think small, tangible things like that Friday meeting can make a huge difference because I was speaking to a colleague I have that's been in higher education for 40 years, and I was talking about something like Notebook LM. And when they saw the potential of even a tool like that, they said, I wouldn't have even thought something like this is possible. So it's not that I would even be resistive to this idea. It wouldn't have even crossed my mind. So I think having those types of open conversations, people just become aware of what's possible. It makes this so much more approachable. So I think that's a really tangible solution for those of you watching this looking for, again, tangible takeaways. That's an amazing point there, Angela. And I think the idea of reevaluating assessment is something I'm hearing a lot about. So that's exciting as well. And I think the attitude of trial and error is essential right now. So that's a tough one to embrace, I know, for institutions, but I think it's critical right now because it's the only way to see what works and what doesn't, like you're saying. One thing I'm curious about, and I know other institutions and leaders will be as well, is did you face any opposition, resistance from faculty, from staff? Understandable resistance and hesitation just because of how new and how quickly things are changing. But did you face any opposition that way? And do you have any advice on how to potentially overcome some of the initial concerns with this type of rapid change?
Yeah, I mean, with any big change, you're always going to see a little bit of resistance. But I also would like to give us a little bit of advice for everybody listening there is that when you think about adopting AI, regardless of if you're a business or if you're a higher education institution, it's much more of a cultural shift and a cultural change that you have to institute than a technological one, right? When you think about these generative AI solutions or ChatGPT, literally there's no real skill in it other than talking to it like a human. But there's this thing in our brain that says, hey, this computer isn't a human. And so there's like this weird perception shift of how we want to use it. But at the end of the day, it's, can you type a sentence? Can you say a sentence? And you'll get some kind of output. Obviously, there's more layers to it from the tech side of it. But if you're just using it, right, like at the high level, that's all it is. But the harder shift is getting people to buy into the technology, really kind of reevaluate how they've been doing things for the past 30, 40 plus years, and getting them to kind of start thinking about this new technology in a way that is going to disrupt everything. So I'll give a little bit of our approach, some of the resistance we initially faced. Um, so I will say that we were blessed in having Dean Dave Marchek be very, very bullish on this. And I would say he's been an outstanding leader where he's really kind of come from the top down saying, hey, here's our goal with AI. This is where we want to be. Let's start figuring out how to do it. Right. And when you have a conversation with him, I'm sure he can talk a little bit more about what exactly that looks like.
He
But
is
so we
next.
had support from the top, right? And I want to say that support from the top has been super, super essential. And then at the same time, from the bottom, we always had a handful of professors who, like, regardless of if, we can use AI or not, we're going to experiment and use it anyway. So what we've kind of done to kind of pull that missing middle, or like the 50% of our faculty who are inquisitive, might kind of want to dabble with it, but don't really know where to get started, or want to like wait to get the technology a little bit better before they want to jump in. We had those AI Friday meetings where it can be kind of casual, but we also invested a lot into having outside industry experts kind of come to our campus to really showcase how they in finance or marketing or I don't know, insert any domain, how they're technically and actually using it, and give a demo of how AI has completely changed their role over the past year. And so in this past, I guess a year ago, spring, we had one of our alums come onto our campus who's in investment finance. And she did the ultimate Karate Kid moment, right? Where she was teaching her old finance professors, here's how we're using all these generative AI tools. And when I tell you that the finance professors, like their jaws were on the floor, like they couldn't believe how much that the investment finance has been like integrating AI. And so I think that wake up call of bringing the experts of these are the careers that our students are going to be going into, and here's the skills that they're going to need, was really this wake up call in each of those domains of like really reflecting and evaluating like what this now needs to look like in their curriculum. The other piece to that we've done is we've also just done a lot of conversation and culture building around curriculum. What does it look like? What doesn't it look like? Getting people in a room, and that's been super helpful with those AI Friday conversations of like, let's just talk about it. And I think that cultural shift is really how we've gone from a small few classes to a much, much larger portion of all.
That's extremely helpful to know because it is a massive jump to go from 20 to 58. That's a extremely rapid increase, but I think again that's an incredibly valuable mentality to have now. For the schools who have had that mentality kind of traditionally where they involve industry in those conversations, I've always seen the benefit to that of asking the people who are ultimately in the roles these students are interested in, what is it like in the field, and keeping that relationship strong. And I know a lot of schools ask for support on how to strengthen their employer relationships. I think that's an incredible way to do it, Angela, is to involve them early on in those classroom presentations, in the conversation around curriculum. It just makes a ton of sense. Here's what's happening in the field. Here's what we need students to be capable of, and it creates just a much stronger network that way. So I think that's extremely tangible and useful advice again. And like you said, those kind of Karate Kid moments are interesting, right? When you see how quickly things are changing, and they have to be, right? Businesses have no choice in that sense. So it's good to keep higher ed aware of what's happening and how quickly things are changing. And with that in mind, that's one example I think of a student who has the kind of stories we want to share. Are there other examples or success stories so far that come to mind around some of these changes? Students who have graduated, programs that have been successful, specific courses that have really embraced this new adoption of AI technology, or anything like that, whether it's a program you've been a part of or one you've heard of that might be worth sharing?
Yeah, I mean, I could talk all day about what those 58 classes look like, and there's a little mini success story in each of them, I'm sure. The one that I want to highlight today comes from our marketing department. They ran this past spring an experiential learning kind of class where we partnered with a solopreneur. And inside their classroom, they basically used AI for their 20 marketing students and said, okay, we need to make an entire brand packet for the solopreneur, right? They're a one-man show. They don't really know exactly what they need to do for marketing, but they know that they need to do something. And so they came up with this like 40-page brand packet that was like, here's your logo, here's your colors, here's what your website's going to look like, here's your tags on all of your rugs, because they sold Afghani rugs that were like handmade by women. And so by the end of it, they had like a list of like 20 plus tools that they ended up using, right? Between some AI automation, like AI workflow automations and some content generation, through creating their booklet, through helping them create logos and packets. And they really just embraced like the messy nature of all of this AI landscape and kind of just exposed all the students to trying a whole bunch of stuff, getting exposed to how these tools work, and then ultimately creating this like really, really nice looking like brand packet that they could give to the solopreneur and enabled him to use all these AI tools that they were using so that he could kind of have that marketing scale and marketing presence, even if it's just this one man show. So I think that class is like the perfect example of what exactly we're trying to do. We're like, now we're helping an actual person, right, in the outside who's a solopreneur, but also giving all of our students this exposure into like what their real world careers might start looking like, because in marketing especially, it's getting super, super disrupted.
That's an incredible example because it's been something I've been thinking about whenever faculty will ask me, well, what are we supposed to evaluate students on now that AI is a resource they can use? Because it's completely changed doing things like essays, anything completely written. And I heard this concept come up last year at a conference I was at where, well, now we can expect more of them in a positive way. Now we don't have to just say, here's the idea for a marketing package. Here is the marketing package. It's an incredible opportunity to help them expand what they can do and what they can ultimately provide. So that's an incredible story to hear it actually put into action, that these students used AI to take it from concept to something they could actually provide this solopreneur. And I have no doubt many of them probably thought, well, if they can do this, maybe entrepreneurship might be a path they're interested in because they can see what they're now capable of. Thanks for sharing that story, Angela. And in terms of tools and things, those students might have been using or tools you've come across, do you have any quick tips or recommendations on specific AI features, tool sets, or programs that you would, share with other folks who, again, might be new to even approaching AI? Maybe they've tried Chat GPT, but are there other tools out there you would recommend they check out?
So we just announced a partnership with Perplexity. They are another big AI player out there. The reason why we partnered with them is that they tend to have slightly less hallucinations, where they have an entire indexing. So like their system underneath the hood is a little bit different in terms of how they do it, but in every single response that you get, they'll cite sources either from the web, or if you have your own content, it'll cite the sources that you've like given Perplexity access to. And so with this partnership that we have, all of our classes now will have like 24/7 like tutor bots, where we can upload all of our course material, whether it's like syllabus and readings, like whatever it might be, into a particular space that students will have access to. And so they can like go into Perplexity, and just like you would with a Google question, you can say like, hey, when's my exam for Professor Virtue's class? Or when's this homework due, right? Or like all those questions that would typically come up. And the reason why we're super excited by that is that there's been a lot of research that students go to all these AI tools, particularly like in the middle of the night, or like right before an exam. It'll be between like 1 a.m. and like 4 a.m. And I'm obviously asleep because I'm tired and a grandma now. Not really, but
Reasonable, between 1 and 4 a.m.
the
Yes,
the
that's a
aesthetic,
reasonable time to sleep.
and so it'll kind of give students like another tool to like kind of reinforce all the learnings in the classroom and in the curriculum in a pretty cool way. I know you brought up Notebook LM before. Very similar in terms of how Perplexity works, right? Where
Yes.
you upload your content, it'll do a little audio thing, or it'll give you the study guides and stuff like that. So it's kind of similar, a little bit more generalized than just that one specific use case. But it's been super cool to see our use cases in that.
Okay, that's helpful. I always find it's nice to have context from someone who's actually used it. So that's one to check out for sure, folks, is Perplexity. And yeah, I definitely recommend checking out Notebook LM as well, especially for the podcast feature, where if you don't like reading long form content, that feature is incredibly useful to put that into a podcast form. The last kind of question I think we have time for, Angela, and again, I really appreciate you making time for this today, is there anything you're hoping AI will be capable of in the future? You know, now that you've kind of seen what's possible so far, are there areas you're hoping that it might be able to support or specific functions you would be excited to see it able to do?
So the one thing that I've been experimenting with a lot lately is trying to gamify a lot of my course content for my students, which is just like kind of, it sounds kind of weird, but in all of these like large AI systems, whether it's Claude or Google Gemini or even ChatGPT at this point, you could like upload some of your course content. So for example, I have a lecture on cybersecurity, right? And so I was thinking like, how can I get my students to like really understand like all that's involved, like almost like a tabletop experience. I was like, I wonder if like AI can like help me just like come up with like a game or a tabletop experience. And what it did is it kind of gave me two options, right? It gave like an entire game, right? That I could like basically do like this virtual like role playing scenario, like you guys are the hackers and you guys are the this people, like whatever. Like think of it as like a business who just got hacked, like what would we do? But the other more interesting thing is that it would also create like a little online like computer game, right? Where like students could then like click through and like go through this all on their own and like say, it was something kind of like, over 10 days you're going to get hacked and here's all of the responses that you can do and you have to like pick the ones that you want to pay for, but you have a specific budget. It was like super cool, right? And like I literally it was 5 minutes. I was like, oh, can you turn this content into a game? Right? Like that's literally all I said. Like try anything super hard or exciting. And I was like, huh, it actually kind of can. So I'm like now thinking of like, is there a way to kind of gamify this or give students like a different experience kind of in the classroom or in the content that can kind of reinforce it, right? Because you see the rise of Duolingo and the gamification of a lot of the education stuff and getting students to kind of stick to it. And anytime we do like a Kahoot poll or like a Kahoot game in the class, like everyone's like buzzing, right? So it's like, is there a way to kind of do this more? So that's something I'm kind of experimenting with, and I think is kind of an interesting way to repackage a lot of the content or like the traditional way that we would do a lot of our delivery.
That makes me wanna take your course, Angela. That sounds like a ton of fun. A great way to learn. I think, fun sometimes gets, forgotten about, and it's extremely powerful. And I heard another example of that recently where there was a fake news simulator game, and the concept was that the students have to generate this fake news, and it's designed to highlight the, methods that can be done with so that it becomes easier to identify them in real life. So, of course,
That's
again,
great.
an experimental concept, but something to highlight exactly what you're saying, what happens behind the scenes, how these things work in a more interesting and engaging way. So, I hope we see more of that. I think that's going to be a really interesting way to learn. And again, thank you so much for your time today. I know I have to let you go in a minute here, so truly appreciate it and hope we can have you back on in the future because these conversations always go so much quicker than I think they will.
Absolutely. Well, thanks again for having me and to be continued.
Absolutely. Have a good one, Angela.